Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that shaped everything about the world you're living in right now. We're walking through the entire story of the civil rights movement, from the first acts of quiet defiance to the moments that changed laws, changed minds, and changed what it meant to be American. This isn't the version you got in school, sanitized and shrunk down to a few famous speeches. This is what it actually felt like to live through it, to risk everything for dignity, to wonder if tomorrow would be the day things finally changed, or the day they got worse. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations, you've just woken up black in America in 1950. The good news is that slavery ended 85 years ago. The bad news is that nobody told the South, or the North really, but the South isn't even pretending anymore. You open your eyes in a small house in Montgomery, Alabama, or maybe Memphis or Jackson, or any of the 1,000 towns where the rules are written in custom and enforced with violence. The law says you're equal. The law is lying. Your life is governed by a system called Jim Crow, named after a minstrel character, which tells you everything you need to know about how seriously your humanity is taken. Here's how the system works. You can't drink from the same water fountain as white people. You can't sit at the same lunch counter. You can't try on clothes in department stores because your skin might contaminate the fabric. You ride in the back of the bus, and if a white person needs your seat, you stand, or you get off, or you get arrested, or you get beaten, depending on the mood of the driver and the passengers and the police who might or might not show up. You can't swim in public pools. You can't use public restrooms in most places. You enter buildings through back doors if you're allowed to enter at all. The movie theater has a separate entrance, a separate staircase, a separate balcony where you sit in the dark and watch the same film as the white folks below, breathing the same air, which is apparently the only thing they'll share. The signs are everywhere, colored and white, over doorways, over fountains, over the entrances to parks and beaches and hospitals. The signs don't explain themselves. They don't need to. You learn to read them before you learn to read words. The humiliation is the point. Every interaction reminds you of your place, and your place is beneath. Not separate, but equal, as the Supreme Court once pretended. Just separate, just less, just other. The water from the colored fountain is warm, the fountain itself rusted and poorly maintained. The white fountain is clean, cold, functional. The metaphor is so obvious it hurts. And if you forget your place, there are consequences. The Ku Klux Klan rides at night, burning crosses, burning houses, burning bodies. Lynching isn't history. It's current events. Black men are murdered for looking at white women, for being too successful, for asking to be paid fairly, for no reason at all except that someone felt like killing and knew they'd face no punishment. The sheriff is often in the Klan, the judge is often in the Klan, the jury is always white. Justice is a word that applies to other people. Between 1877 and 1950, over 4,000 black Americans were lynched, and those are just the ones that were documented. The real number is higher. The bodies that disappeared into rivers and swamps and unmarked graves, they don't show up in the statistics. You survive by learning the rules so deeply they become instinct. You step off the sidewalk when white people approach. You lower your eyes. You say yes sir and no ma'am, and you never ever let your anger show. The anger is there, of course. It's always there, burning in your chest, but you've learned to swallow it because the alternative is death. Your parents taught you this. Their parents taught them. The knowledge passes down like an inheritance nobody wanted. You teach your children the same lessons, hating yourself for doing it, knowing it might save their lives. Look down, speak softly, don't run, don't argue, come home alive. But here's the thing about oppression. It requires cooperation. It requires the oppressed to accept, or at least to appear to accept, the terms of their subjugation. And in church basements and living rooms and barbershops across the South, people are starting to talk about what happens when they stop cooperating. The NAACP has been fighting legal battles for decades, chipping away at segregation case by case. Thurgood Marshall and his team of lawyers have been arguing before courts that separate is inherently unequal, building towards something big. Black newspapers like the Chicago Defender and the Pittsburgh Courier spread stories of resistance and success to communities that white media ignores. Veterans who fought fascism in Europe are coming home and asking why they should accept fascism in Alabama. They stormed beaches at Normandy. They're not afraid of a bus driver in Birmingham. The ground is shifting. You can feel it beneath your feet. A tremor that could become an earthquake. Something is about to happen. It just needs a spark. The legal breakthrough comes first. Brown v. Board of Education, 1954. The Supreme Court unanimously declares that segregation in public schools is unconstitutional. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. The words ring like a bell across the country. In black communities, there's cautious celebration. Finally, the highest court has said what everyone knew. The system is wrong. But in the South, the reaction is fury. Georgia's governor promises that his state will never integrate. Mississippi forms a state sovereignty commission to fight desegregation. Politicians sign the Southern Manifesto, pledging massive resistance. The decision changes the law, but changing the law and changing reality are different things entirely. The spark that ignites the movement comes from a seamstress on a bus. December 1st, 1955, Montgomery, Alabama. Rosa Parks is 42 years old, and she's tired. Not just physically tired, though she is that too. After a long day of work at a department store where she alters clothes but isn't allowed to try them on. She's tired of the humiliation, tired of the daily degradation, tired of a system designed to remind her that she doesn't matter. When the bus driver orders her to give up her seat to a white passenger, she refuses. Not dramatically, not with a speech. She just says no. The driver threatens to have her arrested. "You may do that," she says. And he does. Now here's what they don't always tell you. Rosa Parks wasn't just a tired woman who spontaneously decided she'd had enough. She was a trained activist, the secretary of the local NAACP chapter, a woman who had attended the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee, where she studied nonviolent resistance and movement building. She understood exactly what she was doing. Her arrest wasn't an accident. It was an opportunity. Black leaders in Montgomery had been waiting for a case like this. Someone respectable, someone unimpeachable, someone whose arrest could galvanize the community. There had been other arrests before, other women who refused to give up their seats, but their circumstances weren't right. Their backgrounds might be attacked. Rosa Parks was that person, a woman of impeccable character whose dignity could not be questioned. Within days, the Montgomery bus boycott begins. E.D. Nixon, a Pullman porter and union organizer, and Jo Ann Robinson, an English professor at Alabama State, worked through the night to organize. Robinson mimeographs thousands of flyers announcing the boycott, her hands stained with ink, the machine running until it nearly breaks. Black residents, who make up the majority of bus riders, simply stop riding. They walk to work, miles sometimes, in the December cold. They organize carpools, share rides, wear out their shoes on sidewalks that weren't designed for this much traffic. The bus company bleeds money. The city loses revenue. The white power structure is stunned. They expected this to last a few days, maybe a week. It lasts 381 days. You're part of this. You're waking up before dawn to walk to your job across town. Your feet ache. Your shoes have holes that you stuff with newspaper. But there's something in the air that wasn't there before. A feeling of collective power you've never experienced. At mass meetings in churches, you sing freedom songs and listen to speakers, including a young preacher named Martin Luther King Jr., just 26 years old, who talks about love and justice and nonviolent resistance in ways that make your heart race. He quotes the Bible and the Constitution and philosophers you've never heard of, weaving them together into something that sounds like prophecy. The boycott isn't just about buses anymore. It's about proving that black people can organize, can sacrifice, can win. The white response is predictable and vicious. Houses are bombed, including King's, with his wife Coretta and their baby daughter inside. They survive barely. A crowd of angry black men gathers outside, some of them armed, ready to retaliate. King walks onto his damaged porch and tells them to go home, to put away their weapons, to love their enemies. It's the first real test of non-violent philosophy under fire, and somehow it holds. Boycott leaders are arrested on trumped-up charges under an ancient anti-boycott law. King goes to jail for the first time. Insurance companies cancel policies on carpool vehicles. The city tries to shut down the taxi services that are helping people get to work. But the boycott holds. The walking becomes its own kind of protest, a daily declaration of dignity. An old woman, asked if her feet are tired, supposedly replies, "My feet is tired, but my soul is rested." Whether she actually said it doesn't matter. The sentiment is real. Every step is a vote. Every mile is a message. And in November 1956, the Supreme Court rules that bus segregation is unconstitutional. When the buses finally integrate, it feels like the world has shifted on its axis. It's just buses. It's just one city. But it's proof that change is possible. It's proof that ordinary people, organized and committed, can defeat a system that seemed invincible. The movement spreads, and so does the backlash. In Little Rock, Arkansas, 9 black students attempt to integrate Central High School in 1957. The governor, Orval Forbes, sends the National Guard not to protect them but to block them. You watch on television as these teenagers, dressed in their best clothes, walk toward the school while a white mob screams hatred, spits, threatens murder. One girl, Elizabeth Eckford, ends up separated from the group, alone against the crowd. Her face a mask of terrified composure as grown adults shriek at her. The photograph of her becomes iconic, becomes impossible to explain away, becomes an indictment that the whole world can see. President Eisenhower, reluctantly, sends federal troops to escort the students. For the first time since Reconstruction, the federal government uses military force to protect black civil rights. Soldiers with bayonets walk children to algebra class. The symbolism is extraordinary and terrible, but troops can't protect you from everything. Inside the school, the Little Rock Nine face daily torment. They're shoved into lockers, tripped on stairs, called names that nobody should have to hear. Someone throws acid in one girl's eyes. Another is kicked down a flight of stairs. They endure a year of violence for the right to learn what white students learn. Think about that. Children fighting for education, treated like enemy combatants in their own country. And these are the ones who make the news. In thousands of other schools across the South, integration doesn't happen at all. The law says one thing, reality says another. The next wave comes from unexpected quarters. College students. Greensboro, North Carolina, February 1st, 1960. 4 freshmen from North Carolina A&T, a black college, walk into a Woolworth's department store. They buy some school supplies, keep their receipts to prove they're paying customers, then sit down at the whites-only lunch counter and order coffee. The waitress refuses to serve them. They don't move. They sit there, polite, patient, until the store closes. They come back the next day, and the next. Within 2 weeks, the sit-in has grown to over 300 students. Within 2 months, the movement has spread to 54 cities in 9 states. The sit-in movement explodes across the South. Nashville, Atlanta, Birmingham, dozens of cities see black students sitting quietly at lunch counters while white mobs pour ketchup and mustard on their heads, burn cigarettes on their necks and arms, beat them with fists and clubs. The students don't fight back. They've been trained in non-violent resistance, drilled in workshops where they practiced being insulted, being hit, staying calm. In Nashville, the workshops are run by James Lawson, a divinity student who studied Gandhian non-violence in India. Students take turns playing the roles of protesters and attackers, learning to absorb blows, to go limp when dragged, to protect their heads and vital organs without striking back. The discipline is extraordinary. You watch a young man get coffee poured over his head, and he doesn't flinch, doesn't raise his hands, just keeps sitting there, dignity intact despite everything. A young woman is pulled from her seat and kicked repeatedly. She doesn't cry out. She doesn't fight. She just curls up and waits for it to be over, then gets back on her seat. The violence exposes the ugliness of segregation in ways that arguments never could. Television cameras capture white adults beating children for sitting peacefully. The images are broadcast across the nation, across the world. Segregation has always relied on being invisible to those who benefit from it. The sit-ins make it impossible to look away. Here's what nonviolence actually meant. It wasn't passive, it was strategic. The movement understood that they would never win a violent confrontation. The state had all the weapons, all the power, all the legitimacy to use force. What the movement had was moral authority, but only if they could maintain it. Every act of white violence against peaceful protesters shifted public opinion. Every photograph of a well-dressed student being brutalized made segregation harder to defend. The suffering was real, but it was also tactical. This was warfare by other means, and the battlefield was the conscience of white America. You're drawn into the movement now, maybe reluctantly at first. Maybe you're scared, and you should be. People are dying for this, but you can't stay on the sidelines anymore. You attend mass meetings where the singing shakes the walls, where the pews are packed so tight you can barely breathe, where the spirit moves through the crowd like electricity. We shall overcome. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. This little light of mine. We are not afraid. The songs aren't just music. They're courage made audible, a way of transforming fear into determination. You learn to link arms with strangers who become family because you're risking everything together. The person beside you might be a preacher or a domestic worker, a college professor or a sharecropper. In the movement, those distinctions blur. The students organized themselves into the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, pronounced SNCC. They're young, impatient, willing to take risks that older leaders won't. They push the movement forward, sometimes clashing with the established organizations like the NAACP and King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference. The energy is incredible, the debates passionate, the commitment total. These young people are remaking themselves and the country at the same time. The Freedom Rides come in 1961. The Supreme Court has ruled that segregation in interstate bus terminals is unconstitutional, but the South ignores the ruling. Integrated groups of activists board buses in Washington, D.C., heading into the Deep South to test whether the law means anything. They know what they're riding into. They've written their wills. They've prepared themselves for prison, for beatings, possibly for death. In Anniston, Alabama, a mob slashes the tires of one bus, follows it out of town, and firebombs it. The riders nearly burn alive as the mob holds the doors shut. They escape only when the fuel tank explodes and the mob fears for their own safety. The photographs show the bus in flames, black smoke rising against an Alabama sky. Freedom riders collapsed on the grass with smoke inhalation. In Birmingham, the police conveniently disappear for 15 minutes, while Klansmen attack riders with pipes, baseball bats, bicycle chains. One man is beaten so badly, he requires over 50 stitches and suffers permanent brain damage. The photos go worldwide. International embarrassment forces the Kennedy administration to act. The Interstate Commerce Commission finally enforces desegregation of terminals. It took burning buses and broken skulls to make a Supreme Court decision real. Birmingham, 1963. The movement decides to target the most segregated city in America, the city where bombings are so common. Black neighborhoods call it Bommingham, the city where Bull Connor runs, public safety like his personal fiefdom. Connor is exactly what his name suggests, a bull-headed racist who will provide the confrontation the movement needs. The theory is called Project C, with C standing for confrontation. The movement will provoke Connor into violent overreaction, and the violence will be broadcast to the nation, building pressure for federal civil rights legislation. Martin Luther King is arrested on Good Friday and writes his letter from Birmingham jail, scrawling it in the margins of a newspaper, on scraps of paper smuggled in by his lawyers. It's a masterpiece of moral argument addressed to white moderates who counsel patience. For years now, I have heard the word wait, he writes. It rings in the ear of every Negro with piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. He distinguishes between just and unjust laws. He invokes Socrates and Jesus and the Hebrew prophets. He writes about the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, and argues that they are a greater obstacle than the Klan. The letter is smuggled out and published, becoming one of the foundational documents of the movement. But the campaign is struggling. Adults are reluctant to march, afraid of losing jobs they can't afford to lose, afraid of violence they've seen too much of, afraid for their families. The jails aren't filling fast enough. Then James Bevel, a young SCLC organizer with a shaved head and overalls, has an idea. Use the children. It sounds insane. It is insane. King himself hesitates, but they're running out of options. On May 2nd, over 1,000 black students skip school and march downtown, singing freedom songs. Some are 6 years old, some are 18. They march in waves, and Bull Connor arrests them all. The jails overflow. They put children in the fairgrounds, in makeshift detention centers. The next day, more children march. Connor loses whatever restraint he had. He orders fire hoses turned on them, the pressure strong enough to strip bark from trees, to rip clothes from bodies, to send small children tumbling down the street like leaves. He releases police dogs. The photographs are horrifying. A German shepherd lunging at a teenage boy named Walter Gadsden. Children pinned against walls by water cannons. Girls in Sunday dresses knocked off their feet by the force of the spray. You're in Birmingham now, and you can't believe what you're seeing. These are children, some younger than your own, facing down men with hoses and dogs. They're terrified and brave in equal measure, and their courage is breaking something open in the national conscience. The images go around the world. President Kennedy reportedly says the photographs make him sick. He goes on television and calls civil rights a moral issue, as old as the scriptures and as clear as the American Constitution. Within weeks, Birmingham's white business leaders agree to desegregate lunch counters, drinking fountains, and fitting rooms. It's a victory purchased with the suffering of children, and nobody pretends the cost wasn't obscene. The summer of 1963 accelerates toward a climax. Medgar Evers, NAACP Field Secretary in Mississippi, is assassinated in his driveway on June 12th. He'd been organizing voter registration, investigating murders, pushing Mississippi toward justice. A white supremacist named Byron de la Beckwith shoots him in the back with a rifle as Evers gets out of his car. His wife Merle and their children find him bleeding on the doorstep, his keys still in his hand, a stack of NAACP t-shirts reading "Jim Crow must go" scattered around him. He dies an hour later. 2 all-white juries deadlock on Beckwith's guilt. He walks free. Justice won't come for 30 years. In response to the mounting pressure, plans crystallize for a massive march on Washington to demand civil rights legislation. The idea isn't new. Philip Randolph had proposed a similar march in 1941, threatening it until President Roosevelt integrated defense industries to head it off. Now Randolph's vision finally becomes reality. On August 28, 1963, over 250,000 people gather at the Lincoln Memorial, the largest political demonstration in American history to that point. Black and white together, stretching from the monument to the Washington Memorial. A sea of humanity demanding justice. You're there. You took a bus that left at midnight, sat upright all night with your neighbors and strangers who became friends somewhere around Philadelphia. You're exhausted and exhilarated. The heat is brutal, the sun relentless. You stand for hours, pressing toward the reflecting pool, trying to see the speakers who look tiny in the distance. Some speeches are forgettable. Some are powerful. John Lewis, just 23 years old, delivers a fiery address that's been toned down at the last minute because other leaders found it too radical. He still manages to ask, which side is the federal government on? The crowd roars. And then Martin Luther King takes the podium. He starts with his prepared text, solid but formal, about the promissory note America has defaulted on. Then Mahalia Jackson, the great gospel singer standing behind him, calls out, "Tell them about the dream, Martin." And he does. He sets aside his notes and he preaches. His voice rises and falls in rhythms that reach into your chest and grab your heart. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. You're crying now, and so is the woman next to you. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. The words wash over you like a baptism, like something holy and impossible and necessary. Free at last, Free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last. The crowd explodes. For a moment, just a moment. The America King is describing feels possible, feels imminent, feels like you could reach out and touch it. The moment fades, but the memory stays. 18 days later, a bomb explodes at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, the church that had been a staging ground for the children's marches. 4 little girls, Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, and Denise McNair, are killed. They were in the basement, changing into their choir robes, talking about the first day of school. The youngest was 11. The bomb blows a hole in the wall, buries them in rubble. 22 others are injured. A young girl staggers out of the wreckage, her clothes blown off, her sister dead beneath the debris. The violence hasn't stopped. The hatred hasn't softened. The dream feels very far away. But the movement doesn't stop. Stopping would mean the deaths meant nothing. President Kennedy has submitted a civil rights bill to Congress. Then Kennedy himself is assassinated in November. Lyndon Johnson, the new president, takes up the cause, using his legendary legislative skills and the nation's grief to push the bill forward. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 passes after the longest filibuster in Senate history, Southern senators talking for 57 days trying to kill it. The law outlaws discrimination in public accommodations, in employment, in federally funded programs. It's a landmark achievement, the most significant civil rights legislation in a century. And it's not enough, because there's another right, more fundamental than lunch counters, that the South is still denying: the right to vote. On paper, black men have had voting rights since 1870. In practice, the South has constructed an elaborate system to prevent black voters from registering. Literacy tests that white applicants never have to take, administered by registrars who decide whether your answers are correct. Poll taxes that poor people can't afford. Questions impossible to answer correctly, like how many bubbles in a bar of soap, or how many grains of sand on this beach. Registrars who are only open during working hours, who lose paperwork, who simply refuse to register anyone black and dare you to do something about it. And behind all the bureaucratic obstruction stands the threat of violence. Register to vote, lose your job. Organize voter registration, lose your life. Mississippi is the hardest. In 1964, only 6% of eligible black voters are registered. Some counties with majority black populations have no black voters at all. Civil rights organizations launch Freedom Summer, bringing white college students from the North to work alongside black activists on voter registration. The theory is that violence against white Northerners will attract national attention in ways that violence against black Mississippians hasn't. It's a grim calculation, an acknowledgement that white lives are valued more highly by the media and the public. The theory proves correct in the worst possible way. 3 workers, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, disappear in June. Chaney is black, from Mississippi, 21 years old. Goodman and Schwerner are white, from New York, 20 and 24. They were investigating a church burning when they were arrested by a deputy sheriff, held in jail until dark, released, and then abducted by Klansmen. The FBI searches for 44 days. The national press covers it obsessively because 2 of the victims are white. Their bodies are found buried in an earthen dam. Chaney had been savagely beaten before being shot. The coroner says he'd never seen bones so badly shattered. The summer continues despite the terror, maybe because of it. Volunteers face constant harassment, beatings, bombings. 37 churches are burned. 30 homes and businesses are bombed. Over 1,000 people are arrested, 6 people are murdered, 80 are beaten. And still they knock on doors. Still, they try to convince terrified sharecroppers that registering to vote is worth the risk. Some do register, though the numbers are small. They risk everything for a ballot. Selma, Alabama, 1965. The movement chooses this city for a voting rights campaign because only 2% of eligible black voters are registered despite years of effort. The sheriff, Jim Clark, is another Bull Connor, a violent racist who wears a button reading "Never" on his lapel and keeps a cattle prod on his belt. For weeks, activists march to the courthouse to register. For weeks, they're beaten, arrested, driven back. A young man named Jimmy Lee Jackson is shot by a state trooper while trying to protect his mother and grandfather during a nighttime march. He dies 8 days later. The response is a march from Selma to Montgomery, 54 miles, to demand voting rights. On March 7, 600 marchers set out across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, named for a Confederate general and Klan leader. On the other side, state troopers and sheriff's deputies wait in a line across the highway. They give the marchers 2 minutes to disperse. Then they attack. Tear gas, billy clubs, men on horseback riding down unarmed people. John Lewis has his skull fractured by a trooper's nightstick. Amelia Boynton is beaten unconscious and lies bleeding on the pavement. The footage airs that night, interrupting a television movie about Nazi war crimes, and America watches in horror as uniformed officers brutalize American citizens whose only crime is wanting to vote. You're in Selma. You were on that bridge. Your eyes still burn from the tear gas. There's blood in your hair from where a troopers club caught you. You're scared in ways you've never been scared before. And you're also certain, absolutely certain, that this matters more than your fear. The day becomes known as Bloody Sunday. It's a turning point. President Johnson goes before Congress and uses the movement's own words. We shall overcome. The Voting Rights Act passes in August. The act transforms Southern politics. Federal registrars replace hostile local officials. The literacy tests disappear. The poll taxes are struck down. Within 2 years, black voter registration in Mississippi jumps from 6% to nearly 60%. Black officials begin winning elections at local, state, and eventually national levels. The political map of the South starts to shift in ways that continue to this day. But the movement is changing too, and not all the changes feel like progress. The cities of the North explode in riots. Watts in 1965, Detroit and Newark in 1967. Frustration boiling over in places where legal segregation never existed, but poverty and police brutality and housing discrimination created their own kind of oppression. These aren't Jim Crow states. These are cities where black families fled seeking freedom and found ghettos instead. Martin Luther King turns his attention to economic justice, to the Vietnam War, to issues that make him more enemies than friends. His popularity drops. His allies fracture. Some younger activists reject nonviolence, embrace black power, demand immediate change instead of patient suffering. You feel the shift. The unity of the early movement fractures into competing visions. Some want integration, some want separation, some want revolution. Stokely Carmichael raises his fist and shouts "Black Power" at a rally in Mississippi, and the phrase becomes a lightning rod. It means different things to different people. Self-defense, economic independence, cultural pride, political organization. The media mostly hears violence, which isn't fair, but isn't entirely wrong either. The Black Panthers carry guns in Oakland. following police cars to monitor arrests, daring the state to respond. The singing at mass meetings feels different now, more defiant, less hopeful. The dream that felt so close in Washington seems to recede with every passing year. Progress has been made, real progress, but the promised land isn't here yet, and you're tired, so tired, of walking. April 4th, 1968. Martin Luther King is in Memphis, supporting a sanitation workers' strike. The workers, almost all black, carry signs reading "I am a man," demanding basic recognition of their humanity. King has been talking about death lately, about the threats against his life, about not fearing any man. The night before, he gave a speech at the Mason Temple that now reads like prophecy. "I've been to the mountaintop," he said, "and I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we, as a people, will get to the promised land." The next evening, standing on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel, he's shot by an assassin. You hear the news on the radio, and something inside you breaks. The man who taught you about love and non-violence, who made you believe that redemption was possible for a country that had done so much evil, is dead. Cities burn that night, over 100 of them, flames rising in grief and rage. Washington, Chicago, Baltimore, Kansas City. The smoke rises over American cities like a funeral pyre. It feels like the end of something. Maybe it is. But here's what the history books sometimes miss. The movement didn't die with King. It transformed, splintered, continued in 1,000 different forms. The Black Power movement channeled rage into pride, into community programs, into a new assertion of identity and worth. The Panthers ran free breakfast programs for children, health clinics, schools. The women who had always been the backbone of the movement, often uncredited and overlooked, carried their organizing skills into feminism, into welfare rights, into local politics. Fannie Lou Hamer, Diane Nash, Ella Baker, Septima Clark. They kept working long after the cameras left. The young people who had marched as children grew up to become mayors and congressmen and professors and parents who raised the next generation with different expectations. And you carried it forward too, in ways large and small. Maybe you registered voters for the rest of your life. Maybe you taught your children the history, made sure they understood what was sacrificed so they could drink from any fountain, sit at any counter, vote at any polling place. Maybe you just lived with more dignity because the movement gave you permission to demand it. The movement wasn't just the famous names and the famous moments. It was millions of ordinary people making choices that added up to change. The work wasn't finished. It's still not finished. The Voting Rights Act has been gutted by the Supreme Court. Mass incarceration has created new forms of racial control. Police violence against black people continues to spark protests that echo the marches of the 60s. The Dream King spoke of remains just that, a dream, beautiful and unrealized. Every generation discovers that the fight for justice doesn't end. It just changes form. But here's what you carry with you, lying in your bed tonight, thinking about all those people who came before. They proved something. They proved that ordinary people, organized and committed, can change the world. Not quickly, not easily, not without suffering that would break most of us. But they did it. They walked when they couldn't ride. They sat when they couldn't stand. They marched into violence and didn't turn back. They loved their enemies, or at least acted like they did, because that was the only way forward. The civil rights movement wasn't a single story with a clear ending. It was 1,000 stories, interwoven, sometimes contradicting each other, stretching from the first enslaved person who ran for freedom to the teenager protesting tonight. You're part of that story, whether you know it or not. The choices you make, the stands you take, the silences you refuse to keep, they all connect to that long line of people who decided that things could be different. So tonight, as you settle into whatever comfort you've been given, think about those who had no comfort at all. Think about the woman who said no on a bus. Think about the children who faced down dogs and fire hoses. Think about the young men who boarded buses into violence and the old women who walked miles to work rather than ride in the back. They were scared. They were tired. They did it anyway. And because they did, the world you live in is different. Not perfect, not finished, but different. The movement is a gift passed down through generations, a reminder that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice only if people bend it. You can rest now. You've earned this moment of peace, bought by people who never got to rest, who gave everything they had so you could lie here free. Honor them by remembering. Honor them by continuing. The work goes on. It always goes on. And somewhere, in some church basement or living room or street corner, someone is starting again, picking up where the last generation left off, refusing to accept what is because they can imagine what could be. That's the story. That's the whole story. And it doesn't end until justice does. Congratulations, you've just woken up free. It's 1866, and the Civil War ended last year. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. You are no longer property. You can go where you want, marry who you choose, keep your children, build a life. The good news is that everything has changed. The bad news is that nothing has changed. You open your eyes in the same cabin where you slept as a slave, on the same plantation where you picked cotton for someone else's profit, surrounded by the same white people who owned you a year ago and still act like they do. Freedom, it turns out, is a word. Reality is something else entirely. The cabin smells the same as it always has, wood smoke and damp earth, and the particular mustiness of a structure that was never meant to last, thrown together from rough planks with gaps wide enough to see daylight through. The roof leaks when it rains, has always leaked, will continue leaking because fixing it would require materials you don't have and time you can't spare. Your straw mattress rustles as you shift your weight, the same sound you've heard every morning for 20 years. Through the gaps in the walls, you can see the cotton fields stretching toward the horizon, the same fields where your back has bent and your hands have bled since you were old enough to drag a sack. Everything looks the same. You're the one who's supposed to be different. You sit up and take stock of your situation. You own nothing. The clothes on your back belong to you now, legally anyway. A rough cotton shirt and trousers worn thin at the knees, patched so many times the patches have patches. That's about it. No land, no tools, no mule, no seed, no money, not a single coin to your name. No education because teaching slaves to read was illegal, punishable by whipping for the slave and fines for anyone foolish enough to teach. No skills beyond farming because that's all you were allowed to learn, all they needed you to know. You have your body, your labor, your hands calloused from a lifetime of work and absolutely nothing else. The freedom to starve is still freedom, technically, but it's not exactly what you dreamed about when you heard the war was over. Here's the situation across the South in 1866. 4 million formerly enslaved people are suddenly free. 4 million human beings who yesterday were property, who could be bought and sold, who had no legal right to their own children. Today they're citizens theoretically, with all the rights that citizenship implies, but they're citizens without resources, without capital, without the accumulated wealth that generations of white families have built on the backs of exactly this stolen labor. The land they worked, the land their labor made valuable, still belongs to the white families who owned them. The tools they used still belong to those families. The mules and horses and wagons, all of it. None of it is yours, despite the fact that your sweat and blood created all the value it possesses. The federal government briefly considered redistributing that land, the famous 40 acres and a mule promise that General Sherman made to freed people in Georgia and South Carolina. Field Order Number 15, issued in January 1865, set aside a strip of coastal land stretching from Charleston to Jacksonville, divided into 40-acre plots for freed families. For a moment, a brief shining moment, it seemed possible that freedom might come with the means to actually be free. 40,000 freed people settled on this land, started building homes, started planting crops, started imagining futures that didn't involve working for the people who'd held them in bondage. Then President Andrew Johnson, a Tennessee Democrat who'd opposed secession but also opposed equality, reversed the policy. He returned the land to the former Confederates who'd committed treason to keep you enslaved, pardoned them for their rebellion, and told you to figure it out. Thanks for your patience during the war. Good luck with everything. The land you'd started to work, the homes you'd started to build, you had to give them back to the very people who'd held you in chains. Some freed people resisted. The army forced them off at gunpoint. So you need to eat. You need shelter. You need some way to survive until you can build something better. The white landowner who used to own you has a proposition. He's standing on the porch of the big house, the same porch where he used to stand watching you work, and he's explaining how things are going to be now that everything's changed. He still has land, hundreds of acres of it, more land than he can work himself. Land that will grow up in weeds without labor to tend it. He still has a big house and connections and credit at the local store. What he doesn't have anymore is free labor. The war took care of that. So he offers you a deal. You work his land. He provides you a cabin to live in, tools to work with, seed to plant, and supplies to get through the year. At harvest time, you split the crop. He takes his share, you take yours. Fair, right? Equitable. A partnership between free men. He says the word partnership, and you both know it's a lie. But what are you going to do about it? His voice has that particular southern smoothness, the tone that used to precede orders and now precedes offers. But the power behind it hasn't changed. He still owns everything you need to survive. That's a kind of ownership that doesn't require legal sanction. You say yes because what else are you going to say? You have no alternatives. The cities have no jobs for you, are flooded with freed people competing for work that doesn't exist. The North isn't exactly welcoming black migrants with open arms, has its own history of segregation and exclusion. Other plantations offer the same deal because they're all facing the same labor shortage. Because they've all figured out that sharecropping is the way to maintain the old system under new names. This is the only game in town, and everyone knows it. You sign a contract, or more likely, you make your mark on a contract someone reads to you because you still can't read, and the terms sound reasonable enough. Half the crop. That's the deal. You can live with that. Welcome to sharecropping, the system that will trap you and your children and your grandchildren in a cycle of debt and despair for the next 80 years. The system that will make slavery look almost honest by comparison, because at least slavery didn't pretend to be fair. Sharecropping will smile in your face while picking your pocket, will promise you freedom while building invisible walls, will technically comply with the Constitution while violating everything the Constitution was supposed to mean. You just signed up for it. You had no choice. Let's talk about how the trap actually works, because the genius of sharecropping is that it doesn't look like a trap. It looks like opportunity. You're going to work a plot of land, maybe 20 or 30 acres of cotton, and at the end of the year you'll get half of what you produce. Cotton prices are decent. In 1866, still recovering from the wartime disruption. A good crop might bring enough money to save a little, to start building towards something, to eventually buy your own land and become truly independent. That's the dream. That's what they're selling you. Here's what they're not telling you. You need supplies to get through the year. Seeds, tools, fertilizer, food for your family, while you wait for the crop to come in. Cloth for clothes that are wearing out. Medicine when someone gets sick, which they will. You have no money to buy any of this. You have nothing but your labor, and your labor won't pay until harvest, which is months away. The landowner generously offers to front you these supplies on credit, to be paid back at harvest time from your share of the crop. This arrangement is called the furnish system, and it's the first link in your chains. The landowner doesn't give you these supplies at cost. He charges whatever he wants, usually marking up prices by 50%, sometimes 100%, sometimes more depending on his mood and your desperation. That bag of cornmeal that costs 50 cents at the store in town, you're paying $1 for it, charged against your future crop. That plow blade? Triple the normal price. The seeds you need to plant the cotton, marked up so much you're starting the year in debt before you've planted a single row. Everything you need to survive becomes a debt you haven't earned yet, priced at rates designed to ensure you never quite break even. But wait, there's more. You don't just owe the landowner, you owe the local merchant too, through something called the crop lien system. The merchant agrees to extend you credit throughout the year, accepting a lien on your future crop as collateral. He also charges whatever he wants, also keeps the books himself, also marks up prices beyond anything reasonable. The legal system backs him up. If you don't pay, he can take your share of the crop before you see a single dollar. Now you have two creditors, both charging interest, both keeping their own records that you can't read and couldn't challenge even if you could. The debt accumulates invisibly, silently, like water rising around your ankles while you're too busy working to notice. The interest rates deserve special mention because they were criminal, quite literally criminal by any modern standard. Merchants and landowners commonly charged annual interest rates of 25%, sometimes 40%, sometimes even higher. Some historians have found rates equivalent to several 100% annually when all the hidden charges were included. But there were no usury laws that applied, no regulations, no oversight. The rates were whatever the creditor said they were, written in books you couldn't read, calculated using math you'd never been taught. The work itself is brutal, exactly as brutal as it was under slavery. Possibly worse in some ways because at least under slavery the master had an investment in keeping you alive. You're up before dawn, before the sun cracks the horizon, fumbling in the dark to dress and eat something, anything, from the meager supplies you've bought on credit. In the fields, by first light, because every hour of daylight is money, or rather, every hour of daylight is a tiny reduction in the impossible debt hanging over you. Cotton doesn't pick itself, doesn't plant itself, doesn't cultivate itself. The sun beats down on your back, the same sun that beat down on your father's back and his father's back for generations. Your hands crack and bleed from the bowls. The cotton plant defends itself with sharp edges, and after hours of picking your fingers, look like they've been through a grinder. Your back aches from stooping, a constant low fire of pain that never fully goes away, that wakes you in the night and makes you feel old at 30. The cotton rows stretch to the horizon, endless, infinite, demanding. Row after row after row, and when you finish the last row, you start again at the first, because there's always more work, always another task. You work from can see to can't see, the old phrase for dawn to dusk, and then you go home to a cabin that's falling apart. Eat food you're paying double for, and try to get enough sleep to do it again tomorrow. The exhaustion is cumulative. It builds in your bones. By the end of harvest season, you're a walking shell, held together by habit and necessity. Your wife works beside you because one person can't work enough land to make the math work. Even with both of you laboring from dawn to dark, the crop might not be enough. She bends and stoops and drags the sack alongside you, pregnant or not, nursing or not, because there's no alternative. Your children work beside you as soon as they're old enough to drag a sack, which means 6 or 7 years old, sometimes younger. Tiny hands learning to pick cotton. Tiny backs learning to bend under burdens. School is a luxury you can't afford. Not when every hand is needed in the fields. Not when the crop has to be big enough to pay off the debt. Your children grow up functionally illiterate, just like you, trapped in the same system you're trapped in, inheriting nothing but labor and debt. The landlord watches everything. His overseer rides through regularly, checking on the crop, checking on you. The dynamic is disturbingly familiar. The same white man on horseback, the same scrutiny, the same implicit threat beneath the surface politeness. You're not a slave anymore. You're free. The law says so. But the overseer still tells you what to plant and when to plant it and how to cultivate it. Cotton, he says. Only cotton. The landlord determines when you can leave the property and what you can do with your time. Want to visit family on another plantation? You need permission. Want to take a day off? Better hope the overseer's in a good mood. Freedom has a lot of asterisks attached. Here's the thing about cotton. It's a cash crop, not a food crop. You can't eat it. But the landlord insists you plant cotton, because cotton is what he can sell, what he can use to pay his own debts, what the whole southern economy runs on. The world wants cotton. You'd rather plant some corn, some vegetables, something to feed your family so you don't have to buy food on credit at marked up prices. The landlord says no. Cotton only, every acre, every row. You need to buy your food from his store at his prices, because that's how this works. The system is designed to keep you dependent, to prevent you from achieving any kind of self-sufficiency, to make sure you always need something only he can provide. The harvest comes. You've worked yourself half to death. Your family has worked themselves half to death, and the cotton is ready. The bolls have opened, white fibers bursting from the plants, waiting to be picked. You pick until your fingers are raw, until your back screams in protest. The landlord sends wagons to collect it, takes it to the gin, bales it for sale. You don't go with him. You don't see the scales. You don't witness the transaction. You wait at home while he handles the business, because business is white man's work. Then you come to the big house for the settling up. Settling up is the annual ritual that determines your fate, and it's conducted entirely on the landlord's terms. He sits behind a desk with a ledger book, your account, a record of everything you've been advanced throughout the year. Every bag of meal, every yard of cloth, every tool, every seed, all meticulously recorded in handwriting you can't read, using numbers you can't verify. He tells you what the cotton sold for. He tells you what you owe. He subtracts one from the other, and somehow, miraculously, impossibly, you come out even. Or worse, you come out behind. The conversation goes something like this. The crop brought $400 this year. Pretty good crop. You worked hard. Your half is $200. But let's look at what you owe. Seed, $40. Fertilizer, $30. Tools, $25. Food for your family, that's $115 for the year. Cloth and sundries, another $30. Interest on the balance, $15. That comes to $255. You're $55 in the hole. You want to object. Something doesn't add up, even in your math-deprived understanding. You don't remember the food costing that much. But you can't read the book. You can't verify the prices. Even if you could, challenging a white man's honesty in the post-war South is dangerous. The Klan rides at night. Black men who get too uppity, who don't know their place, who question white authority, they have a way of disappearing. The threat doesn't have to be spoken. You nod, you accept the accounting, you sign another contract for next year, because what else can you do? Where else can you go? The debt follows you. The system has you. Let's talk about the fraud because it was endemic, systematic, universal. This wasn't a few bad actors exploiting an otherwise fair system. This was the system itself, designed for exploitation. Studies from the era suggest that most sharecroppers were cheated consistently and substantially. Landlords routinely reported lower cotton prices than they actually received, pocketing the difference. They inflated the costs of supplies. They added charges for things never delivered. They manipulated weights at the gin. They charged interest rates that would make a loan shark blush. The legal system was complicit. Southern states passed laws specifically designed to maintain the sharecropping system and punish anyone who tried to escape. Vagrancy laws allowed police to arrest any black person who couldn't prove employment, essentially criminalizing freedom of movement. Arrested vagrants could be leased out to plantations to work off their fines, a system called convict leasing. That was slavery by another name. Contract enforcement laws made it illegal to leave a plantation while in debt to the landlord, which meant always, which meant you could never leave legally. Enticement laws made it illegal for other landowners to offer you better terms. The system was rigged at every level, by design, with intention. You want to understand why this was worse than slavery in some ways. And I need to be careful here because slavery was an absolute horror that shouldn't be minimized. The violence was constant, the dehumanization complete, the theft of life and labor total. Nothing excuses slavery or makes it acceptable. But under slavery, you had a certain terrible security. The master had a financial interest in keeping you alive and healthy because you were his property, his investment. A slave who died was money lost, just like a mule that died. Economic self-interest, not morality, meant that masters usually fed you enough to work, provided basic medical care when sick, housed you adequately. The cruelty was bounded by economics. Sharecropping removed even that protection. The landlord had no investment in you personally. You weren't his property. You were a replaceable cog, a pair of hands among thousands of pairs of hands desperate for work. If you got sick, that was your problem. If you died, there were plenty of other desperate freedmen to take your place. If your children starved, that was unfortunate, but not his concern. You were responsible for your own survival now, but you were trying to survive within a system designed to extract maximum labor while providing minimum return. The violence was different too. Under slavery, violence was mundane, routine, a management technique. Under sharecropping, violence was episodic but terrifying, designed to maintain psychological control. The Ku Klux Klan emerged precisely in this period. White-robed terrorists who rode at night, burning houses, burning churches, lynching anyone who seemed to threaten the social order. The violence wasn't random. It was targeted at people who challenged the system, who accumulated too much property, who voted or tried to vote, who seemed too successful or too free. Everyone else watched and learned the lesson. Stay in your place. Accept your poverty. Don't make trouble. You lie awake at night and hear hoofbeats in the distance, and your heart races even though they're probably not coming for you. Probably. Tonight. The terror is ambient, atmospheric, a constant background hum that shapes every decision. You don't complain about the accounting. You don't question the prices. You don't organize with other sharecroppers to demand better terms, because organizers tend to disappear. You keep your head down and hope the violence passes you by. This is freedom. This is what you fought for, what men died for. This. Let's talk about the women, because sharecropping was particularly brutal for black women in ways that deserve specific attention. Under slavery, women worked in the fields alongside men, but many also worked in the big house, cooking, cleaning, doing laundry. That labor was exploitative and often accompanied by sexual violence, but it happened indoors, away from the worst of the sun. Sharecropping pushed everyone into the fields because every hand was needed. Women worked pregnant, their bellies swelling as they bent over cotton rows. Women worked nursing, strapping infants to their backs, or leaving them with elderly relatives too old for field work. Women worked while somehow also maintaining homes, cooking meals, raising children in the margins of days that had no margins, and they were vulnerable in ways men weren't. Sexual violence had been endemic under slavery. That didn't stop with emancipation. It just became unspeakable in a different way, a threat hanging over every interaction with white men. Landlords, overseers, merchants, any white man with power could assault a black woman knowing she had no recourse. Report it. To whom? The sheriff was probably in the clan. The courts wouldn't take her word against a white man's. The powerlessness was comprehensive, and it was inherited by daughters who grew up watching their mothers navigate an impossible situation. The children grew up in this system, knew nothing else, were shaped by its limitations before they could understand what was happening. By 6 or 7, they were working in the fields. Education was theoretically available. The Freedmen's Bureau established schools, and black communities sacrificed enormously to build schoolhouses and hire teachers. But attending school meant losing a worker, and losing a worker meant a smaller crop and more debt. Most sharecropper children attended school sporadically, for a few months in winter when the fields were dormant, learning just enough to remain functionally illiterate. The cycle perpetuated itself with mathematical precision. A child who couldn't read couldn't verify accounts. An adult who couldn't do math couldn't challenge fraudulent bookkeeping. A family without education had no way to enter any profession except farming, no way to escape. Each generation inherited the limitations of the previous one. Born into debt, working to pay off debt, dying in debt, passing debt to children who started the whole miserable cycle again. Sharecropping wasn't just an economic system. It was a machine for producing permanent poverty, designed and maintained by people who needed a permanent underclass. Let's talk about attempts to escape, because people tried. They always tried. Human beings are stubbornly hopeful, even in situations designed to crush hope. Some sharecroppers accumulated enough one good year to pay off debts and leave. Maybe cotton prices spiked unexpectedly. Maybe the landlord was slightly less dishonest than average. They moved to different plantations, hoping for better terms, fairer accounting. Usually they found the same system wearing a different face. The new landlord used the same tricks, kept the same fraudulent books. Some fled to cities, to Birmingham or Atlanta or New Orleans, looking for industrial work, for something different from the endless cotton rows. They found overcrowded slums, discrimination in hiring, violence from white workers who didn't want black competition. The cities offered survival, but rarely prosperity. Factory jobs paid better than sharecropping, but not by much, and the costs ate up the difference. Still, people kept coming, kept fleeing the rural trap for urban uncertainty. Some tried collective action. The Colored Farmers Alliance organized in the 1880s and 1890s, bringing together black sharecroppers to demand better terms, to pool resources, to challenge the system collectively. At its peak, the alliance claimed over 1 million members. The response was savage. Organizers were murdered. Members were terrorized. In 1891, black cotton pickers in Arkansas organized a strike demanding better wages. White mobs responded with what can only be called a massacre, killing at least 15 strikers, possibly many more. The lesson was clear: organize and die. Most people learned the lesson. The Great Migration began around 1910 and accelerated through the following decades. Millions of black Southerners fleeing north to Chicago, Detroit, New York, Philadelphia, anywhere but here. They crowded onto trains with everything they could carry, leaving behind land they'd worked for generations, family members who couldn't or wouldn't come. The North wasn't paradise. Discrimination, segregation, poverty followed them. Redlining kept them in overcrowded ghettos. Unions excluded them from the best jobs. But at least they could vote. At least they could walk down the street without dipping their head to every white person who passed. At least their children might go to school full time. The migration emptied the rural South of much of its black population. A demographic revolution driven by desperate people seeking any alternative. Those who stayed found the system slowly, grudgingly evolving over decades. The New Deal brought federal programs that helped some sharecroppers, though Southern Democrats made sure black farmers received less than their fair share. Mechanization changed agriculture more than any reform effort. The mechanical cotton picker, developed in the 1930s and widely adopted after World War II, could do the work of dozens of human hands. The tractor replaced the mule. Suddenly, landowners didn't need sharecroppers anymore. They evicted them, pushed them off the land, left them to find their own way. By the 1960s, sharecropping as a system was dying, killed not by reform or justice, but by machines, by economics, by changes that made the old arrangements unprofitable. The tractor didn't care about your debt. But here's the thing about 80 years. That's generations. That's great-grandparents and grandparents and parents, entire family lines bent and broken by a system designed to keep them poor. The wealth that wasn't accumulated, the education that wasn't obtained, the opportunities that weren't available, those gaps don't close automatically when the system ends. They compound. They echo forward through time. A family that spent 80 years in debt peonage doesn't magically achieve middle-class stability because the legal structure changes. They start from zero, again, still, always. While white families who benefited from their labor start from whatever they've accumulated over those same 80 years. The numbers are staggering when you think about them. At the peak of sharecropping, millions of black families were trapped in the system across the South. Millions of people working land they'd never own, producing wealth they'd never share, raising children into the same trap. The total value extracted runs into billions of dollars in modern terms. It represents one of the largest transfers of wealth from black to white hands in American history. A transfer that happened legally, routinely, generation after generation, while the rest of the country looked away or pretended it was fair. And it wasn't just black farmers, though they bore the heaviest burden. Poor whites got caught in the same system, signed the same exploitative contracts, faced the same fraudulent accounting. The racial hierarchy meant black sharecroppers were treated worse, had even less recourse, faced violence that white sharecroppers largely escaped. But poor whites learned something too, that their whiteness brought them privileges but not prosperity, that the planter class would exploit anyone it could. Think about what sharecropping stole. Not just labor and money, though it stole plenty of both. It stole time. Decades of time that could have been spent building something. It stole potential. The doctors and lawyers and teachers and inventors who never emerged because they spent their childhoods picking cotton instead of reading books. It stole the futures that people might have built if they'd been allowed to keep what they earned. Every sharecropper's child who could have been something, who had the intelligence and drive but not the opportunity, that's a theft. Every family that could have accumulated property instead saw everything siphoned away. The system didn't just exploit people in the present, it foreclosed their futures for generations. You want to understand the racial wealth gap in America today? Start here. Start with freed people who owned nothing, who were promised 40 acres and a mule and received neither. Start with 80 years of stolen labor, fraudulent accounting, and systematic impoverishment. The median black family today has about 10% of the wealth of the median white family. That gap didn't appear by accident. It wasn't created by personal failings. It was constructed through systems exactly like sharecropping, through theft disguised as contract. Let's return to that cabin one more time. It's 1890 now. 25 years since freedom came. You're still here, older now, your body broken by decades of labor. Your children are grown and sharecropping on nearby plots, repeating your life exactly. Your grandchildren are already learning to pick cotton. The landlord is different now, the son of the man who owned you. But the system is the same. You still can't read. You still owe more than you can pay. You'll die in debt, and your children will inherit that debt. You used to pray it would be you, that you'd be the one to break free, to buy land. That prayer faded years ago, replaced by smaller prayers. Enough food for winter, a healthy crop, children who survive. But sometimes, late at night, you let yourself remember what freedom felt like in those first days after the war. The possibility in the air, the sense that anything might happen, that the world was remaking itself. You remember the hope before the reality set in, before you understood that freedom without resources was just another kind of cage. And here's the strange thing, the human thing that systems can never fully crush. Some of them did live differently. Not all, not most, but some. Some sharecropper's grandchild scraped together enough education to become a teacher. Some scraped together enough money to buy land finally, after generations. Some made it north and built something, a foundation for the next generation. The system was designed to be inescapable, and for many it was. But human beings are stubborn, creative, relentless. They find cracks, they slip through. The people who survive sharecropping are not footnotes in history. They're the reason there's a black middle class today, however embattled. They're the reason the Great Migration happened, the reason Harlem and Bronzeville and countless other black communities exist. They took almost nothing, and they built. Not fast enough, not far enough, not without terrible costs. But they built. Sharecropping officially ended decades ago, but its ghosts walk through the present. The rural South still bears the scars. The assumptions that undergirded sharecropping, that black labor could be exploited without consequence, that freedom was a word rather than a condition, Those assumptions didn't vanish when the contracts stopped being signed. They evolved, found new forms, continued their work through redlining and mass incarceration, and 1,000 other mechanisms. So tonight, as you settle into whatever comfort you found, think about the people who worked sunup to sundown for nothing. Think about the women who labored while pregnant, who watched their children disappear into the same trap. Think about the children who never learned to read because the cotton needed picking. They weren't lazy. They weren't stupid. They were caught in a machine designed to crush them, and they survived anyway. That survival is their legacy. The sharecroppers of the American South represent one of history's great endurances. Not triumphs because the system mostly won, but endurances. They survived what was designed to break them. They passed on life and hope, and sometimes small scraps of progress to children who passed it on to their children. The line continues. You might be part of it. Their story matters because it's not over. The forces that created sharecropping, the desire to extract labor without fair compensation, the willingness to use law and violence to maintain exploitation, those forces are still with us, wearing different faces. Recognizing sharecropping for what it was helps you recognize what it became and what it might become again. The freed people who signed those first contracts in 1866 believed they were stepping into freedom. They were stepping into a trap. But they didn't know, couldn't have known, how thoroughly they were being deceived. You know now. That knowledge is worth more than the debts their descendants were forced to carry. Use it, remember it, pass it on. The cotton fields are quiet now, mostly, given over to machines or other crops, or nothing at all. The cabins have fallen down, the ledger books rotted into dust, the names fading from memory. But the story remains, waiting to be told. They worked, they suffered, they endured, they hoped, and against all odds, some of their hope survived, passed down through generations like a seed waiting for better soil. You carry that seed now. Whatever you do with it, remember where it came from. Remember the cost. Remember the people who paid it. And maybe, in remembering, help build the world they dreamed about but never got to see. The world where freedom means something more than a different kind of chain. They earned that dream with 80 years of stolen labor. They never stopped earning it. Neither should we. Congratulations. You've just been ripped from your homeland and thrown into the belly of a ship. The year is somewhere in the early 1700s, and you're crammed below deck with hundreds of other human beings, stacked like cargo in a space so tight you can't turn over without pressing into someone else's sweat-soaked skin. The smell is beyond description. Human waste, vomit, fear, and death all fermenting together in the humid darkness. The wooden planks above you drip with condensation, and somewhere in the distance, you can hear chains rattling as someone shifts position, trying to find relief that doesn't exist. You can't see the ocean, but you can feel it. The endless rocking, the groaning of the hull, the constant reminder that you're being carried somewhere you never asked to go. The crossing takes weeks, maybe months. Time loses meaning in the darkness. People around you get sick. Some of them die. Their bodies are unchained and hauled above deck, tossed into the water like garbage. You hear the splash. You wonder when it will be your turn. But here's the thing. Even in this floating tomb, someone starts to hum. Maybe it's a woman near you, her voice barely above a whisper, threading together sounds from home. Maybe it's a man chanting something rhythmic, tapping his chains against the floor like a drum. The slavers tried to strip away everything. Your language, your family, your name, your gods. But they couldn't reach inside your chest and rip out the music. That stayed. It had to. Because for millions of Africans forced across the Atlantic, music wasn't entertainment. It was memory. It was prayer. It was the only thing they could carry that couldn't be confiscated. The rhythms from West Africa, the polyrhythmic drumming traditions of the Yoruba, the Akan, the Mandinka, these didn't vanish just because the drummers were now in chains. They went underground. They adapted. They waited. So you survived the Middle Passage. Barely. You step onto American soil, somewhere in Virginia or South Carolina or Louisiana, and your new life begins immediately. There's no orientation, no adjustment period, no moment to process what just happened to you. You're sold at auction like livestock, prodded and examined by strangers who look at your teeth the way they'd inspect a horse. They squeeze your arms to check muscle tone. They make you walk back and forth to prove you're not lame. Whatever name you had before, forget it. You're something else now. Property with a pulse. And then you're put to work. The fields stretch out in every direction, tobacco or rice or cotton depending on where you've landed, and the sun beats down with a heat that feels personal, like the sky itself has decided to punish you. Your back bends, your hands blister, then callous, then blister again on the new calluses, and the overseer watches from horseback, whip coiled at his side like a sleeping snake that could wake at any moment. Here's where the music becomes something new. The slaveholders, in their infinite paranoia, banned drums almost immediately. They understood, perhaps instinctively, that drums were dangerous. Drums could communicate across distances. Drums could coordinate rebellion. Drums could carry messages in codes that no white ear could decipher. So the drums disappeared. But rhythm didn't. It just moved somewhere else. Into the clapping of hands, the stomping of feet, the slapping of thighs, into work songs that kept exhausted bodies moving through 18-hour days. You're in the field now, chopping weeds under a murderous sun, and someone starts a call, a single voice rising over the rows. And then everyone responds, their voices weaving together, finding a groove that makes the unbearable almost bearable. The songs weren't just about passing time. They were about surviving it, about finding enough reason to lift the hoe one more time, bend down one more time, drag yourself through one more hour until the bell finally rang. Now let's talk about what's actually happening in these fields, because this is where American music really begins, whether America wants to admit it or not. You're singing, but you're not singing anything the slaveholders would recognize as music. The melodies bend and slide in ways European ears find strange, even disturbing. The harmonies stack in unexpected intervals that don't match anything in the hymn books. The rhythm doesn't march in neat squares like military music or dance in predictable patterns like waltzes. It swings, it syncopates, it breathes. It pushes against the beat, then settles back, then pushes again. This is the African musical DNA, refusing to die. The blue notes that would later define jazz and blues, those flatted thirds and sevenths that sound like crying and laughing at the same time. The call and response patterns that would echo through gospel and soul and hip-hop for centuries to come. The polyrhythmic complexity that would eventually become funk, where multiple rhythms interlock like gears in a machine. All of it's being born right here, in the most brutal conditions imaginable, by people who weren't supposed to create anything lasting. They were supposed to work and die and be forgotten. Their names were supposed to vanish from history. Instead, they invented the musical language that would conquer the planet. The irony is almost unbearable. The same system designed to strip humanity from millions of people accidentally created the conditions for one of history's greatest artistic achievements. Because when you take away someone's drums, they make their body a drum. When you take away their language, they create a new one. When you try to crush their spirit, they build cathedrals of sound that will outlive every plantation house and every slaver's fortune. Let's move to Sunday. If you're on certain plantations, you might get a few hours off. The Lord's Day, they call it, which is deeply ironic considering how these same people use their Lord's book to justify owning you. But never mind that for now. Maybe you gather with other enslaved people in what they call praise houses, rough wooden buildings where the music takes on a different character entirely. This is the birth of the spiritual, and it's something the slaveholders completely misunderstand. They see black people singing about Moses and the Promised Land, about crossing the Jordan River, about being delivered from bondage, and they think it's proof that Christianity has taken hold, that their mission to civilize the savages is working. Some of them even feel proud about it. What they don't realize, what they can't realize because their position depends on not realizing it, is that every one of those songs carries double meaning. When you sing about Moses telling Pharaoh to let his people go, you're not just retelling Bible stories. You're encoding messages of resistance right under the master's nose. The Jordan River isn't just a biblical landmark. It's the Ohio River, the boundary between slave states and free soil. Follow the Drinking Gourd isn't a pleasant nature song. It's detailed instructions for escaping north using the Big Dipper as a guide. Wade in the Water tells runaways to use streams to throw off the scent for tracking dogs. The spirituals are a masterclass in survival through misdirection, coded communication disguised as simple faith, and they sound absolutely beautiful while doing it. The harmonies lift toward heaven even as the words point toward freedom. So the decades roll by, and something terrible and something inevitable approaches. The Civil War explodes across the country, and suddenly the system that held 4 million people in bondage begins to crack and splinter. You might find yourself behind Union lines now, technically free, but with nowhere to go, and nothing to your name except the clothes rotting off your back. Contraband, they call people like you. A word that makes you sound like smuggled goods rather than a human being finally escaping hell. Or you might still be on a plantation watching the Confederate Army crumble and wondering if the rumors of emancipation are really true or just another cruel trick. Either way, everything changes. And when the guns finally fall silent, when the surrender is signed and the news spreads, you're thrust into a world that doesn't know what to do with you and mostly doesn't want to figure it out. You're free. Congratulations. Now figure out how to eat. Figure out where to sleep. Figure out what freedom even means when everyone around you still sees you as property that somehow escaped. The period after the war is chaos and possibility mixed together in equal measure. You wander the roads looking for family members sold away years or decades ago. Maybe you find some of them. More likely you don't, and the searching becomes its own kind of wound. You show up at Freedmen's Bureau offices, hoping for land that was promised, and then snatched away when the politicians changed their minds. 40 acres and a mule became 40 years and a fool, people started saying, because the betrayal happened that fast. You settle in shanty towns on the edges of cities, or try to scratch out a living as a sharecropper, which is basically slavery with extra paperwork and a thin pretense of choice. The man who owns the land takes most of what you grow. You're always in debt to the company store. The sheriff enforces contracts that might as well be chains. But through all of it, the music keeps evolving. Now that you're not property anymore, at least not officially, you can gather more freely. You can build churches that aren't controlled by white ministers who edited out the parts of the Bible about liberation. You can sing without an overseer monitoring your lyrics for signs of rebellion. The spirituals grow louder, more complex, more joyful. even when the joy is laced with sorrow. Here's where the story splits into 1,000 streams, all flowing toward something nobody could have predicted. In the decades after emancipation, black music starts spreading in every direction at once, like water finding every crack in a dam. In the churches of the South, the spirituals are transforming into something more formally structured. Choirs are forming. Hymnals are being printed. The Fisk Jubilee singers from a black college in Tennessee start touring the country, then cross the ocean to perform in Europe, introducing white audiences to spirituals performed with trained precision and devastating emotional power. They're raising money for their school, which is barely surviving, but they're also doing something revolutionary. They're proving that black music isn't primitive folk noise. It's art, serious art. Art that can make queens weep and move critics to standing ovations. Meanwhile, outside the churches, something raw is brewing. In the levee camps along the Mississippi River, in the turpentine forests of Georgia, in the work gangs, building railroads across the expanding nation, a new sound is taking shape. The blues. You're there now. Imagine it. You're swinging a hammer on a chain gang, the sun like a fist pressing down on your skull, and someone starts moaning a melody that doesn't resolve the way hymns are supposed to. The notes hang in the air, bent and aching, like they're asking questions that don't have answers. The lyrics are about hard times and harder women, about Saturday nights and Sunday mornings, about a world that promised you freedom and handed you a different kind of prison instead, about having nothing but somehow finding the humor in it, about getting drunk and getting heartbroken and getting back up anyway. The blues isn't polite. It isn't uplifting in any simple way. It's honest in a way that makes proper folks uncomfortable. And that honesty is exactly what gives it power. You can't fake the blues. Your life either put that sound in your throat or it didn't. And by this point, millions of lives had been preparing for exactly this music. Now we're pushing into the early 1900s, and the geography of Black America is shifting dramatically. The Great Migration is beginning, a massive movement of millions of black Southerners heading north and west, fleeing Jim Crow laws and lynching trees, and the suffocating limitations of the post-Reconstruction South. They pack onto trains heading for Chicago, Detroit, New York, Los Angeles, Pittsburgh, Cleveland. They carry their clothes in cardboard suitcases and their music in their bones. And when they arrive in these new cities, everything changes again. You step off a train at a station in Chicago, and the air smells different. Coal smoke and factory exhaust, and something like possibility. The streets are crowded with people who look like you, but talk with different accents, dress in sharper clothes, move with a confidence you're not used to seeing. The South Side is forming, black neighborhoods dense with life, and you find a room in a boarding house among all these other recent arrivals. That night, you follow the sound of music spilling out of a club on State Street. Inside, it's hot and loud and alive in a way that feels almost dangerous. Someone's playing piano with a rolling, infectious rhythm. A woman singing about love gone wrong with a voice that could peel paint off the walls. People are dancing, laughing, drinking, forgetting for a few hours all the reasons they had to leave home. This is the birth of urban blues, and it sounds nothing like what you left behind in the Delta. The acoustic guitars are going electric. The bands are getting bigger. The tempos are picking up. The country moan is becoming a city shout. But here's where it gets really interesting. At the same time, blues is electrifying and urbanizing. Something else is happening in New Orleans, a city like no other in America, where French and Spanish and Caribbean and African traditions have been mixing and marrying for centuries, where The boundaries between cultures have always been more porous than anywhere else on the continent. You're walking through the streets of Storyville, the red light district, and music pours from every doorway and window, mixing in the humid air. A brass band marches past playing for a funeral, the mourners dancing behind the coffin in a tradition that confuses and fascinates visitors from up north. In the corner clubs and dance halls, something unprecedented is emerging. Musicians are taking the blues, the spirituals, the ragtime piano, the marching band tradition, European harmonies, Caribbean rhythms, and cooking them all together into something nobody has a name for yet. They'll call it jazz eventually, but right now it's just the sound of black musicians doing what they've always done, taking everything available and making something new. A cornet player named Louis Armstrong is coming up through these streets, learning his craft in a boys' home for orphans and delinquents, absorbing everything, getting ready to change music forever. The 1920s arrive, and you're living in Harlem now. Maybe you moved up during the migration, or maybe you were born here to parents who did. Either way, you're in the center of something extraordinary, something that feels like it might finally prove what black people have been trying to prove since the first ship docked. The Harlem Renaissance is blooming all around you. Writers and artists and intellectuals creating a cultural explosion that announces black genius to a world that had tried to deny it. Langston Hughes is publishing poems. Zora Neale Hurston is collecting folklore. The talented 10th debates what progress should look like. But underneath all the poetry and painting, thrumming through everything like a heartbeat, is the music. You walk down Lenox Avenue on a Saturday night, and the whole street is vibrating with sound. Duke Ellington is playing at the Cotton Club, though you might not be able to get in because the club has that vicious policy of black performers for white audiences only. Doesn't matter. The music seeps through the walls, floats down the block, meets other sounds coming from 100 other venues. Stride piano from this corner. A vocalist doing something devastating with a blues ballad from that one. And everywhere the new jazz, sophisticated and complex and dripping with urban cool. The music is also spreading through a new technology. Radio. For the first time in history, sounds from one place can travel instantly to everywhere else. A farmer in Kansas can hear what they're playing in Chicago. A teenager in Mississippi can tune in to broadcasts from New York. Black music is becoming national music, then global music, transmitted through the air like magic, like something the ancestors couldn't have imagined. Now let's talk about what's happening in the churches, because that stream never stopped flowing. It just kept getting deeper and more powerful. You're in a Pentecostal church somewhere in the South, or in one of those storefront churches that have sprung up in every black neighborhood up north, wedged between barbershops and grocery stores. The preacher is warming up, his voice rising and falling in musical patterns, building toward ecstasy the way a band builds toward a crescendo. The congregation responds, their bodies swaying, their hands clapping, their voices calling back in that ancient pattern that traces all the way to Africa. And then the band kicks in. Drums, electric guitar, bass, maybe a Hammond organ that sounds like it's channeling heaven directly. This is gospel music in its full power, and it's producing singers whose voices will eventually cross over and reshape popular music entirely. Mahalia Jackson is out there somewhere, perfecting a style so overwhelming that grown men weep when they hear her. A young pianist named Ray Charles is sitting in church, going blind from glaucoma, but learning to see music in a way no one else can. A teenager named Aretha Franklin is singing in her father's Detroit congregation, not yet aware that she's going to become a queen. Sam Cooke is here. James Brown spent time here. Little Richard came through. The sacred and the secular are supposed to be separate. but they keep borrowing from each other, passing melodies and techniques back and forth across that porous boundary. The 1940s hit, and the whole world goes to war. Black soldiers ship out to fight fascism overseas while dealing with American apartheid at home. They're dying for a country that won't let them drink from the same water fountains as the people they're defending. The irony isn't lost on anyone. Double V for victory, they call it. Victory over the Axis abroad, victory over Jim Crow at home. But back in the States, the music keeps evolving at furious speed. Bebop arrives in the jazz clubs of New York, pioneered by Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie. Music so complex and fast that it seems designed to separate serious listeners from casual fans. It's intellectual, challenging, and absolutely not meant for dancing. It's also a deliberate assertion of artistic genius in a country that still treats black people as second-class citizens. This music refuses to be background noise. Meanwhile, in the bars and juke joints, something more visceral is building. Rhythm and blues, they're calling it now. Jump blues with big bands. Electric guitar-driven rockers. Songs about Saturday night pleasures delivered with a wink and a thrust. This is the music that teenagers are sneaking off to hear. The music that scandalized parents warn about. The music that would eventually birth something even more dangerous. And then comes the 1950s, and rock and roll explodes like a bomb that's been ticking for 300 years. You're a teenager now, maybe in Memphis or Cleveland or anywhere the signal reaches. You twist the radio dial past the approved stations until you find something that makes your whole body react before your brain catches up. Chuck Berry is duck walking across stages, making his guitar sound like a laughing dare, writing lyrics about teenage life that white kids recognize even though everything about him should be foreign to them. Little Richard is screaming and pounding piano with a ferocity that terrifies and thrills in equal measure, his pompadour and makeup challenging every assumption about how men should look and act. Fats Domino is rolling out hits from New Orleans with a smile that hides centuries of complicated history. This is black music aimed directly at young people, and it's working. White teenagers are sneaking into black clubs or buying records from black artists and falling in love with sounds their parents call primitive, dangerous, ungodly. The music industry sees dollars and gets nervous. They start finding white artists who can perform sanitized versions for wider audiences. Elvis Presley records songs by black composers and becomes the king, crowned by an industry that couldn't stand the thought of a black man holding that title. Pat Boone covers Little Richard and smooths away everything that made the original vital. The theft is blatant and lucrative. But here's the thing. It doesn't actually work the way they want it to. The covers sell, sure, but anyone with ears knows they're inferior. And for every young white person who buys the Pat Boone version, a certain percentage eventually traces their way back to the source and discovers what they were missing. Now we push into the 1960s, and history starts moving so fast it's hard to keep up. You're in the thick of it now. The civil rights movement is erupting across the South. Young people sitting at lunch counters and riding freedom buses and marching into fire hoses. And every step of the way they're singing. We Shall Overcome becomes an anthem, a repurposed spiritual transformed into a declaration of intent. Keep your eyes on the prize. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. The songs bind strangers together into a movement, give courage to people facing down hatred, turn individual protesters into a community that can endure whatever gets thrown at them. But the movement has its own internal tensions about music. The older generation prefers the dignified gospel tradition, the church-rooted sounds that white allies find respectable. The younger generation wants something with more edge. They're listening to what's coming out of Detroit on the Motown label. Songs so perfectly crafted, they could pass on any radio station while still speaking to Black experience. Smokey Robinson is writing poetry disguised as pop songs. Marvin Gaye is crooning with an ache that hints at deeper troubles. The Supremes are conquering charts while wearing gowns and performing choreographed moves, proving that Black elegance can dominate mainstream entertainment. Motown's strategy is deliberate. Berry Gordy runs a finishing school alongside his recording studio, teaching artists how to move, speak, and present themselves in ways that won't threaten white audiences. It's assimilation as survival tactic, and it works brilliantly even as it draws criticism from those who want something rawer and less compromising. Down in Memphis, a different approach is taking shape entirely. Stax Records sits on McLemore Avenue in a converted movie theatre, and the sound coming out of there has sweat and grit baked into every groove. Otis Redding is singing with a desperation that borders on holy. Sam and Dave are trading vocal lines like boxers trading punches. Booker T and the MGs are laying down backing tracks with a multiracial lineup that makes a political statement just by existing. White and black musicians creating together in a city still fighting integration. This is Southern Soul, and it doesn't apologize for its origins. It sounds like Saturday night fish fries and Sunday morning hangovers, like factory work and romantic disappointment, like the lived reality of black life in a region that still hasn't reconciled with its history. And then 1968 hits, and everything shatters. Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated in Memphis, on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel, just blocks from where all that beautiful music was being made. Cities burn. Hope curdles into rage. The music has to change again because the world it was responding to has changed completely. James Brown takes the stage and becomes something more than a singer. He becomes a force of nature, a nuclear reactor of rhythm. You're in the audience at one of his shows, and your body simply cannot stay still, no matter how hard you try. The band hits a groove so tight, it feels like being gripped by a giant hand that knows exactly where to squeeze. Brown screams, grunts, drops to his knees, spins, does the splits, and somehow never misses a beat. The cape routine happens, the dramatic collapse and resurrection, and even knowing it's choreographed doesn't diminish its power. This is funk now, music that prioritizes rhythm above all else, that turns the beat itself into the message. Brown is shouting, "Say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud." And for the first time in American history, that declaration doesn't have to be whispered. It can be screamed over a bass line that shakes windows. Sly and the Family Stone takes the funk in a more psychedelic direction. Their multiracial band presenting an image of integration, even as the dream of integration seems to be dying. Parliament Funkadelic will soon emerge from Detroit with an entire mythology built around funk, costumes and motherships, and a philosophy that treats dancing as liberation theology. And then hip-hop appears, and nothing is ever the same. You're in the South Bronx now, the late 1970s. The neighborhood looks like a war zone because in many ways it is. Landlords burn buildings for insurance money. City services have been cut to nothing. Gangs fight over blocks that nobody else wants. The country has written this place off, abandoned its residents to whatever fate can find them. But in the rubble, something miraculous is happening. You hear it coming from a park, or a community center, or a street party powered by electricity hijacked from lampposts. Someone's playing records on turntables, but they're not playing them normally. They're isolating the break, that few seconds of pure rhythm where everything drops out except drums and bass. And they're looping it, extending it, creating a continuous groove that dancers can ride forever. A voice comes over the microphone, talking rhythmically, hyping the crowd, spinning rhymes that build on each other with increasing complexity. This is hip-hop being born, and nobody recording it or dancing to it or rapping over it has any idea it will eventually become the dominant global youth culture. Kool Herc is throwing these parties. Grandmaster Flash is developing turntable techniques so sophisticated they constitute a new instrument. Africa, Bambaataa, is creating a philosophy around the movement, steering gang members toward artistic battle instead of violent ones. The 1980s arrive and hip-hop spreads from the Bronx to everywhere. You hear it on the radio now, still controversial, still dismissed by older generations and music critics as a fad that will pass any day. Run DMC puts hip-hop in rock arenas, their Adidas sneakers and fedoras becoming uniform for a generation. Public Enemy turns the music into a weapon of political education. Chuck D's booming voice delivering history lessons over beats that sound like sirens and alarms. NWA explodes out of Compton with tales of police brutality and street life so vivid and profane that the FBI sends them an actual letter of concern. The music is being attacked as dangerous, corrosive, responsible for all manner of social ills, which is exactly what they said about blues and jazz and rock and roll and soul. The pattern holds steady across a century. Every generation of black music frightens and captivates in equal measure, gets blamed for moral decay, gets stolen and sanitized, and eventually gets recognized as American classic. Hip-hop is just the latest variation on a very old theme. But we should talk about what's happening parallel to hip-hop, because black music never moves in just one direction. R&B is transforming through the 1980s and 1990s, absorbing hip-hop influence while maintaining its own distinct identity. Whitney Houston emerges with a voice so technically perfect, it almost seems unfair, bringing gospel-trained power to pop ballads that dominate airwaves worldwide. Michael Jackson transcends categories entirely, becoming arguably the most famous entertainer on the planet while dealing with pressures and peculiarities that would eventually contribute to his destruction. Prince is out in Minneapolis, playing every instrument, singing in every style, blurring gender and genre with a deliberate audacity that makes everyone uncomfortable and fascinated simultaneously. New Jack Swing appears, Teddy Riley creating a template that marries hip-hop beats to R&B melody. The sound dominates early 1990s radio, then gives way to smoother, more sophisticated productions as the decade progresses. And we should talk about the constant threat of erasure, because that's part of this story too, and always has been. Throughout this entire history, from spirituals to streaming playlists, black artists have watched their innovations get credited to others, their profits get siphoned away, their stories get rewritten by people who weren't there. Elvis becomes the king of rock and roll. Benny Goodman becomes the king of swing. The British invasion bands of the 1960s acknowledge their black influences, but somehow end up bigger than their sources. The pattern repeats with electronic music, with country music, with virtually every genre that exists. The documentation matters because the theft is ongoing. Not ancient history, but present reality. When streaming platforms pay fractions of pennies per play, when legacy artists discover they never owned their masters, when sampling lawsuits strip hip-hop producers of their earnings, the exploitation continues in updated forms. But here's what all those exploiters could never actually take: the capacity to create, The ability to transform suffering into beauty, to make art that speaks across every boundary. The music that began in the holds of slave ships, that grew in cotton fields and praise houses, that traveled north on crowded trains and spread through radio waves and cable wires and now fiber optics. That music still belongs to the people who made it. Not as a possession, but as a practice. A continuous act of creation that adapts to every circumstance and absorbs every influence while remaining recognizably itself. So here we are, in the present moment, and black music continues to dominate global culture in ways nobody from previous eras could have imagined. Hip-hop has become the most consumed genre on the planet. Its influence visible in languages spoken thousands of miles from the Bronx where it started. Kids in Tokyo and Lagos and Sao Paulo rap in their own tongues over beats that trace back to those South Bronx block parties. R&B has fragmented into a dozen subgenres, from the minimalist experimentalism of artists pushing boundaries to the maximalist gospel-influenced sounds that fill arenas. Afrobeats is flowing back across the Atlantic, African artists collaborating with American ones, completing a circle that started with those ships heading the other direction centuries ago. The streaming economy has created new stars overnight, while making sustainability harder than ever for everyone else. Artists release music directly to fans, bypassing the gatekeepers who once controlled everything, even as those same platforms pay fractions of pennies that make survival difficult. And underneath all the commerce, underneath the algorithms and the playlists and the viral moments, the community keeps doing what it's always done, using music as medicine, as protest, as celebration, as prayer. Tonight, when you close your eyes and let the quiet settle in, maybe think about what it took to get here. The unnamed Africans who carried rhythm across an ocean of horror. The enslaved people who sang in fields and churches, encoding survival in every note. The bluesmen and blueswomen who turned hard luck into art. The jazz innovators who proved that black genius could be as complex and sophisticated as anything from European concert halls. The gospel singers who kept the spirit alive when the material world offered only degradation. The soul artists who soundtracked a revolution. The funk masters who made bodies move without permission. The hip-hop pioneers who built a culture from discarded scraps in abandoned neighborhoods. All those voices, across all those centuries, singing the same fundamental song. We're here. We survived. We made something beautiful out of everything you tried to make ugly, and you can never take that away. So rest now. Let your breathing slow. The music will still be there in the morning, the same way it was there yesterday and the day before, and every day stretching back to the beginning, because that's what this story teaches more than anything else. The music doesn't stop. It just keeps changing, keeps growing, keeps finding new ways to speak truths that need speaking, keeps turning pain into something you can dance to, keeps reminding everyone who listens that creativity cannot be chained, even when bodies can. That's the legacy. That's the inheritance. That's what flowed from those first hummed melodies in the darkness of slave ships all the way to whatever's playing in your headphones right now. Gratitude seems insufficient for what was sacrificed, but maybe listening, really listening, is a kind of honor. And maybe remembering where the music comes from is a form of respect that costs nothing but attention. The ancestors sang so you could hear them. Tonight, let their echoes carry you into peaceful sleep.